Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Manara Podcast. I'm your host, Abir, joined by, as usual, Zan and Khubaib, and as well as a special guest, Liam. And our topic for today is, of course, what's been going on recently. Just really, I think, unprecedented historical events. We saw the end of the Assadist regime in Syria, toppled by the rebels. That's the end of a 50-year regime that's displaced millions and killed hundreds of thousands, not to mention all those that have been imprisoned, some for decades, for pretty much their whole life. So it's been really a tremendous thing to witness, and we're here to discuss it. And really, there's no one better than our guest Liam. And so, Zan, you know Liam, of course, very well. Why don't you just give a bit of an intro into his background, and then we'll get right into it.
No, perfect. That sounds great to be here, and Jazakallah khair for putting this together. Yeah, the reason why we brought our friend Liam on for this is because he has an undergraduate degree from the University of Toronto in politics and religion. He did his master's in SOAS in Middle East politics. He's traveled extensively in the Middle East and went to study Arabic in the Middle East, specifically for the purpose of being better able to access Arabic language news and Arabic language knowledge. And he's currently the head of the Faculty of Religion and Philosophy in a secondary school. And it's great to have you here, Liam. You're a keen observer of events in the Middle East, and we're excited to hear what are your thoughts on what's going on.
Albie, thank you very much. It's good to be here.
Alhamdulillah. Our first sort of question for you was, what do you think? How do you think the revolution in Syria is being received among the Muslims, among the Muslim world, and also among the wider world in the West and other places?
Um, okay, basically in summary, incredibly well. I think that a lot of people are seeing this as one of the biggest victories that the Muslim world has had in a long time. At the very least, since the American withdrawal from Afghanistan. It's a huge victory for the Muslim world. Um, and it's also a huge victory for the Muslim world since it's right in the heart of the Muslim world. Of course, Syria is a very central location. In comparison to, some other Muslim victories in some other places, they're relatively far away, in the periphery, so on and so forth. Because this is this very central location, it's incredibly significant. Of course, Bashar al-Assad was a monster who did terrible, terrible things to people. We all know that. So the fact that this has happened, I think everybody, it's more or less universal. I wouldn't actually, no, I can't say universal. The large majority of people, I would say, are very happy. That's
Mhm.
what I can say.
Okay. And are you talking about the Muslim world specifically or the world as a whole?
Sorry, yeah, of course, Muslim world specifically. And even when I say Muslim world, of
Yeah,
course, I'm talking mainly about Sunni Muslims.
Sunni Muslims.
And
Particularly.
particularly even I could say religious Sunni Muslims. I say
Okay.
amongst religious Sunni Muslims, practicing
Okay.
Sunni Muslims, the overwhelming majority, of course, are very, very happy. Once you start breaking it down more than that,
Yeah,
yeah, it's too much.
I see. And what are some examples of that positive response? I believe a couple countries have made positive statement, a couple groups.
Yeah, of course, countries have made statements. Even, of course, the reception of people. For instance, there's a large Syrian community in Egypt, and the response of the Egyptians to the fall of Bashar al-Assad was to congratulate the Syrians
Okay.
that live in Egypt. And actually, a lot of them expressed sadness that the Syrians are likely now to be leaving Egypt and returning to their homeland.
Okay.
Um, because of course the Syrians have built very good, strong ties with the Egyptians there.
Yeah. All the
Amongst
best food in
Palestine,
Egypt, all the best food in Egypt is Syrian.
it's all Syrian. It's all Syrians, guys. Yeah, of course. Um, Amongst Palestinians, for instance, in Gaza, people were saying the Gazans themselves. If you took a look at Gazan social media, a lot of them were saying that they're the second happiest people in the world. The only people happy are the Syrians.
Okay, well,
So amongst regular people in Gaza, there was a huge outpouring of support. Um, I remember seeing one person say that you would be hard pressed to find anybody that lives in occupied Palestine that actually supports Assad. There's basically everybody's happy. So again, huge, huge outpouring of support. A lot of people are very happy. Again, a lot of people realize the crimes of Assad. And even amongst the people who previously supported Assad,
Mhm.
you are seeing um, more opinions than before of people criticizing Assad, especially as the full extent of Assad's crimes are revealed. Now, in terms of whether these sentiments are sincere or not amongst these people is a different thing, because Assad's crimes have been known for a very long time. But you do see some people, I'm talking about, maybe some Lebanese, maybe some Iraqis, who are saying, hey, look, we realized that Assad was this monstrous person. And especially when we see these people being released from Sadnaya and so on and so forth, they're like, wow, this is too much. So really not too many people, I think, are really sad that Assad is gone. That's what I would say.
Okay, fantastic. That's great to hear. And I heard there was actually official congratulations coming from the government from Afghanistan, from specific Palestinian groups. So even on a sort of official political level, it's not even just general sentiment. There's political level congratulations coming out from us. They were celebrating Afghanistan and things like that. Yeah. Okay,
sorry, go on.
No, that's it. I was just adding to your point.
Yeah, they just to add as well, the reaction I think has been interesting, because I think, like, with events in Syria, often I see people comparing it to like the likes of Egypt and Libya, and like Libya in particular, like we saw kind of the overall view about Gaddafi was very, very negative, even like amongst non-Muslims and then Western media and so on, very, very negative. But with us, that it hasn't been the case. And I do wonder, will that change, kind of as, I guess, things unfold and as it becomes, I guess, more just accepted, the current reality that regime has ended. But I just think I thought that's interesting, especially given even the direct impact to Europe and US and so on of like the influx of refugees from Syria and so on as well. It's weird that it kind of went just largely, I would say, unacknowledged on just the hideous person he was, and the evil things he did, really. And yeah, just I think as well as it is worth touching on the reaction we've had from kind of I guess the non-Muslim world. Like, we've seen a lot of people kind of, I guess, having negative reactions as well over this and saying that this is beneficial for Israel, as well as just more harmful for that part of the region. And do you much thoughts on that reaction, Liam? Are you surprised by it, or do you maybe even understand where some of that viewpoint is coming from, I guess?
That's always been a big thing amongst a lot of leftists in the West. And when I say leftists, it doesn't mean all leftists. You have, sometimes some people like to paint a broad brush to these people. You have lots of really principled leftists, and I mean, like, these guys are full-on socialists. You know what I mean? Who opposed Assad on humanitarian grounds, and who realized that this guy was a monstrous person, and used to even criticize other leftists, and they used to criticize them for being morally inconsistent. So I actually dislike when sometimes say, oh, it's all the socialists who support Bashar al-Assad. Yes, of course, there are people on the left who support Bashar al-Assad, but a lot of them don't. But in terms of the ones who do, and of course, these people, they have, they're big names, big voices. You got people like George Galloway. You got people like, whoever, Rania Khalek, these sorts of people, who, of course, all are Assadists. Like, they supported Assad throughout the entirety of the Syrian civil war, and they had a reputation for it. And even now, they're trying to say, oh, the country's going to descend into chaos and so on and so forth. No, look, these people exist. The reasons for supporting Assad are largely due to their misplaced belief that Assad was a sincere member of resistance to Israel. We'll get on that later, I think, but Assad was never particularly sincere about that. Assad probably would have normalized with Israel quite some time ago if the Israelis were willing to give up the Golan Heights, and if the Israelis were willing to provide him with, or the Americans rather, willing to provide him with some sort of protection for him and his regime. He was never really a incredibly sincere actor. Even in Iran's, quote unquote resistance activists. But a lot of the leftist support for Assad stems from that. And of course, throughout the war, they adopted a lot of Islamophobic rhetoric. The rhetoric they used against the rebels is, they're terrorists, head choppers, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, blah, blah, blah. The same sorts of things that you would have heard from any neocon during the war in Iraq or Afghanistan. Unfortunately, they used the exact same rhetoric. And of course, we saw the results of it is that they provided some form of political cover for Assad during his war.
Okay. And that's really interesting. And so the socialists are a mixed bag when it comes to what extent they were supporting Assad or now lamenting his, let's call it, departure.
Yeah, exactly.
But what would you say about the example, the reaction in for Iran and the Shia world, Lebanon and Iraq? What is it mixed there as well, or is it more one direction?
Kind of. You're getting all these sorts of opinions, and if anybody goes on Arabic social media, you're getting all these sorts of opinions. So for instance, with Iran, right now we've just there are reports coming out. There were reports coming out that was even reported by a Turkish journalist recently. His name escapes me, and I don't want to mispronounce it. Apparently, the rebels have approached the Iranians, and they have asked for some sort of understanding with them. And apparently they've also approached the Russians, and they basically told the Russians, and again, who knows what's going to happen? Everything's up in the air. Everything's a little murky at this point. They've approached the Russians. They've told them you can keep your bases in Syria.
Okay, wow.
Of course, Russia's a different thing, but apparently they've said this to the Russians. And with the Iranians, apparently they've approached them and basically told them, look, we want no troubles with anybody. In terms of the Iranian and Hezbollah reactions, because that's really who we're talking about here. Of course, Khamenei came out and he said, this is a result of Zionist American conspiracy, so on and so forth. So, look, obviously they're not happy about it, but push comes to shove, they also weren't willing to put men on the line to support Assad in the end either. And there were rumors that Iran basically contacted the rebels and they told them, look, allow our troops to leave Syria untouched and don't damage Shia shrines or hurt the Shia population. The rebels said, okay. And the Iranians were like, okay, cool, great. And then they didn't really support Assad at all. There was no support for Assad. There was no support from Hezbollah either. Some people, apparently there were rumors that Hezbollah sent people up to humps and stuff like this. As far as I'm aware, I could be mistaken, but as far as I'm aware, these were all rumors. Hezbollah was completely disengaged from this battle. They had nothing to do with the battle at all. And in terms of the responses, mainly from a lot of the Hezbollah people, I can tell you more about what a lot of the Hezbollah people are saying more than the Iranians themselves, to be honest, just because I have no idea what they're saying in Persian. The Iranian people, I have no idea what they're saying. From the Hezbollah people, obviously you have a lot of like negativity, a lot of like, kind of like, who are these guys? We fought them for so long. They're terrorists. They've taken control of the country, blah, blah, blah. However, you have a lot of other people, including, some relatively prominent people, whether it's Telegram accounts, whether it's Twitter accounts, whether it's just from, quite frankly, I know a fair amount of Lebanese Shia at this point as well. And so just anecdotally from the people that I know, of acknowledgement that Assad was a monster. Assad was a terrible guy. And even when you look at the relations between Assad and Hezbollah, look, of course, Hassan Nasrallah really did improve the relations between Assad and the Lebanese Shia community. He really forged those close relations between Hezbollah and Assad. But there was a time when Assad and Hezbollah were relatively hostile to one another. In the Lebanese civil war, of course, they fought each other at certain points. For instance, at the War of the Camps, Hezbollah was on the opposite side of the Assad regime. So it's not like these two groups have been welded to one another for the entirety of the existence of the Assad regime or the entirety of the existence of Hezbollah. However, of course, obviously they became quite close recently. But even then, again, in terms of, bringing it back to the reactions of the Lebanese Shia themselves, you have a lot of people saying, no, this guy was a monster. And we supported him for our own interests. We supported him because we thought that the rebels were too sectarian and they were going to start a sectarian massacre against the Shia or the Alawi or whatever. But they say, if we look at the new rebels, they say, look, they're not doing that. And the people that we supported, they did terrible things. But at the same time, in terms of genuine positivity towards the rebels, you're not really seeing any of that. The acknowledgement that Assad was a monster doesn't translate into, oh, we hope the rebels do well, and they're saying nice things about the rebels. Nobody's really doing that. There's still not general hostility towards the new. When I say rebels, I mean the new Syrian government. Obviously, there's still general hostility towards the new Syrian government. For instance, now a lot of the Lebanese accounts or general kind of leftist or Shia accounts, so some of the biggest names coming out and questioning the rebels for why they're not doing anything about the Israeli incursion to the country, which we could talk about later as well, because there is questions to be had about that. But they're really pushing them and really attacking them. And in my opinion, they're not attacking them from a sincere angle. They're attacking them from an angle of, we're trying to undermine the new government in terms of public relations, and we want to make them look stupid. So that's kind of the broad reaction. In terms of what it means for Iran, obviously it's you have some people saying it's a disaster and it's the end of the axis of resistance. You have other people saying that perhaps Iran can try to recover from this. It depends on the way that the Iranians themselves want to react. It depends on what the new government also wants. It's all kind of up in the air. But of course, on the whole, just a face value, the Iranians poured billions of dollars into Syria. They lost treasure and blood and so on and so forth. And it's gone like that. Oh, their gains are gone. Obviously, the new government very likely won't respect a lot of the Iranian gains. But we'll see what happens.
And what do you think the reaction is in Russia? Are they just preoccupied with Ukraine right now, and this is sort of a back burner issue?
It seems so. It seems like the Russians are treating it almost the same way that they treated the Armenians, which is basically, you're on your own. Yeah, exactly. They're basically just like, hey, man, whatever. You know what I mean? And they haven't, they bombed during the rebel offensive. But it's not like they rerouted, planes from Ukraine or anything and brought them down to Syria. Again, I think just from a purely pragmatic perspective, and again, Allahu Alam on this, it's likely that the Russians just looked at what was going on. It's like, look, this guy, he can't stop, HTS in Idlib without enormous support. He's not a reliable ally. It's not worth it. And they're too preoccupied with Ukraine. They're like, screw it, whatever. This guy's done. So
I see.
Yeah, God knows what happens with. God knows what they're thinking.
And I guess, I mean, this is a bit of an aside, but I guess we see now that at the time it was apparent there was not a hope, but an expectation that perhaps the Russian intervention in Ukraine would tangibly affect its the balance of power in the Middle East, that they would get bogged down. And I guess now we've seen that on multiple occasions. We've seen that, as you alluded to, with the Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh. Azerbaijan took back their internationally recognized territory because of the lack of the withdrawal of Russian hegemony to a certain extent. And now we've seen the same thing happen in Syria. So it's been a real shift, I guess, in the balance of power. That
yeah. I suppose as well, it feels like unfamiliar territory, as kind of you alluded to earlier, Liam. Like, we saw, of course, what happened with Afghanistan, but even with Afghanistan, like you said, it's a significant nation, but it's not significant maybe particularly in the cause of Palestine. Geographically, it's a big challenge for them to get involved and whatnot. Whereas with Syria, obviously, is a different story. And part of the rhetoric as well has been that this, of course, will be negative for Palestine, and we've already seen Israel going on the offensive. We're taking the Golan Heights and destroying like military caches and things like that were from the Assad regime. What do you what would be your comment on? Well, first of all, was Assad an ally for Palestine, or in any way a deterrent for Israel or Zionist action? Firstly, that's probably the most important question to answer.
In terms of whether Assad was a genuine ally for Palestine, no. In summary, the history of the Assad regime, going back to their, when Hafez al-Assad took control in 1970 approximately, and the history between him and the Palestinians is not a good one. right? Even during the days of the PLO and Yasser Arafat and all these sorts of things, they did not get along. Of course, anybody who knows the history of the Lebanese civil war knows that Hafiz al-Assad intervened in 1976 in the Lebanese civil war in order to fight the Palestinians and aided the Maronite factions who were committing war crimes against the Palestinians. And of course, he did this for two reasons. One, a few reasons, but two reasons related to the Palestinians was to try to get the PLO under his control. The Assad regime always tried to get Palestinian factions under the control and to use them as a way of gaining legitimacy in the Middle East. And also because Hafiz al-Assad was afraid that the Palestinians, through their, militant guerrilla actions, their resistance actions against the Israelis from the south of Lebanon, he was afraid that, the Palestinians are going to win the war in Lebanon. They're going to defeat the Maronite factions. They're going to take control of the country, and they're going to drag Syria into a war at an inopportune moment. So he started attacking the Palestinians. Hafiz al-Assad was not a friend to the Palestinians at all. And then, of course, later on, I said earlier about Hezbollah and the war of the camps. They laid siege to the Palestinian camps. This is even after the PLO was evacuated from Lebanon. This was in 1985 to 1988. The PLO had been more or less evacuated. They were in Tunis at the time. Again, war crimes. You know what I mean? You can go on Al Jazeera. You can watch documentaries about what happened during the war of the camps. Terrible stuff. So that's Hafiz. You go to Bashar. Bashar al-Assad, throughout almost the entirety of what he's done, he, for instance, even when he invited Hamas over to Damascus, and of course Hamas was very famously based in Damascus. It was their headquarters for the political faction that now is based on Qatar. Even during that time, he apparently, in WikiLeaks cables, approached the Americans. I'm sure you guys know about this. He approached the Americans and he basically told them, look, these Hamas people, they're the Muslim Brotherhood. I don't like the Muslim Brotherhood. We're playing a game with them. We're using them. And as far as I'm aware, and I could be mistaken, I haven't revised this, but Bashar al-Assad basically offered the Americans, like, one day we can throw these people out whenever we want. The Assad regime was always, under the table, hostile to Hamas, even when they were based out of Syria. Assad didn't particularly care for the Palestinians, for instance, when he laid siege to the Yarmouk camp, where some of the worst war crimes of the Syrian civil war happened. Now, of course, usually when we say this, the counter argument is a few things. One, in terms of the treatment of Palestinians inside Syria before the Syrian civil war, and of course we have to admit reality was good. It was certainly better than almost any other Arab country, right? So the Syrians were granted lots of rights. They were basically treated as more or less Syrian citizens without taking away their Palestinian identity. So a lot of the Palestinians in that regard, and when you compare them to Lebanon particularly, they were doing better. However, of course, they still suffered from the same oppression that everybody else in Syrian society suffered from. And again, sometimes I think they forget that, if you would be walking the street in Syria and you made fun of a picture of Bashar al-Assad or something like this, you know what I mean? If you made fun of the fact that there's pictures all over the place, something like that, something in the West that we would totally do. You know what I mean? Just like, look at this guy. He's got a picture all over freaking every flagpole. What's this loser? You could disappear. You could be finished. You could die, right? So the Palestinians lived under that oppression in the same way that all the Syrians lived under. But in terms of the rights of the Palestinians, when you compare them to Lebanon or so on and so forth, of course, there was more recognition of the Palestinian identity, and the Palestinians were afforded rights that they're not afforded in Lebanon. Lebanon, they're treated really terribly. I'm not going to lie. Furthermore, in terms of Hamas and their freedom of movement in Syria, it was high. They basically did whatever they wanted when they were in Syria. So it was an effective base of operations for them. But of course, Hamas made their very principled stance during the Syrian civil war to leave in order to not be seen as supporting Bashar al-Assad during his massacre of the Syrian people. Again, in summary, no, Bashar al-Assad is not a friend of the Palestinians. And in terms of his sincerity of trying to fight the Israelis, Bashar al-Assad, all but the name, normalized with the Israelis. He never took action against them. Even the Israelis, people will point out to, but the Israelis used to bomb Syria all the time. The Israelis would bomb Hezbollah and Iranian targets inside Syria. Not that often, rarely in fact, would they bomb Syrian military targets inside Syria, because, of course, everybody knows that the Israelis had a tactic agreement with the Syrian government. And it seems, the greatest evidence of this is the fact that the Israelis just destroyed the entirety of Syrian military hardware in the past couple of days. That the Assad regime was never really going to do anything against the Israelis. Assad, despite the fact that he supported Hezbollah and he was allies with Iran, he was never really going to do anything against the Israelis. And again, even I think a lot of Hezbollah and Iranian people realize that as well. So no, he was never a really genuine and sincere member of the axis of resistance, and he was never concerned with trying to go to war with Israel in order to support the Palestinians. This is not what he was. And anybody who says so, you have ideological blinders on. You're not acting for the best interests of the Palestinian people, because of course there are some people who are misguidedly take the position that they have to support Assad in order to support the Palestinians. You're not supporting the Palestinian people. The entirety of the Palestinian people are against Bashar al-Assad. Bashar al-Assad and the Assad regime did terrible things to the Palestinian people. And of course, furthermore, there's no Palestinian who will tell you that, we have to massacre the Syrian population in order to liberate Palestine. This is not the way this works. Palestine will be liberated by free people, not by this monster who keeps people locked up in these dungeons. But yeah, long story short, no.
That's really useful, Liam. I think it's really important as well, because people are, spewing a lot of misconceptions right now about who Assad was and what his Syria was for the Axis of Resistance and for Palestine. And similarly, on the other side, there's now a lot of misunderstandings about who the rebels are, and whether or not they are in fact proxies. Like, people are throwing around the term, that the rebels are Zionists, which is it's just separate from the fact on whether or not you think they're cooperating with Israel. You realize that Zionism is a 19th century ideology based upon European colonialism that supports the establishment of Israel. It's like, even if you were an ally of Israel, if you were cooperating with Israel, even then it wouldn't necessarily mean you're Zionist. Sorry, it's just silly how people are throwing around terms to such a degree that they lose meaning. Anyway, the question wrapped up in here is, why are there so many misconceptions about the rebels right now? Are they an Israeli or American proxy or a Turkish proxy, and who are they exactly?
So I would say there's two big reasons. One is because, again, of the media campaign that was waged against them, tracing back to the Syrian civil war, when Iran, Hezbollah, and Russia said that these people are American proxies. This is an American conspiracy against Syria, so on and so forth. And so, of course, it's tied up to that. Now, in terms of whether this is true, no, this is not true. This is not to say that the Americans had no involvement with any of the Syrian rebel factions throughout the entirety of the war. They very obviously did, and anybody who follows the war will know and tell you that the Americans very obviously were involved with some rebel factions. Of course, to say that Jolani, Abu Muhammad al-Jolani, was a recipient of American aid is ridiculous, because Abu Muhammad al-Jolani literally destroyed the Syrian rebel factions that were receiving American aid in the north of Syria. He went to war with them, and I remember a famous incident where some of them tried to cross into Syria from Turkey, and right away HTS guys just arrested all of them. No, Abu Muhammad al-Jolani and his people in what are now in the new Syrian government, but were Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. They're not supported by the United States. Abu Muhammad al-Jolani is wanted by the FBI for $10 million American dollars. Not to say that the Americans form policy based off of their terrorism lists. They don't, not really. They can ignore it if they want to. But no, they're not friends. So in terms of who the rebels are, HTS was, of course, back in the day at the beginning of the war, they were Jabhat al-Nusra, which is also where a lot of the hostility towards them comes from, because, of course, Jabhat al-Nusra was the affiliate of Al-Qaeda in Syria. Abu Muhammad al-Julani was sent to Syria from Iraq and, of course, set up, that organization. Basically, over a long period of time, they separated from Al-Qaeda and, in summary, became the modern-day Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which governed the north of Idlib, after going to war, actually, and a lot of infighting between various rebel factions, when Jolani consolidated power around himself, which back in the day led to lots of arguments and all these sorts of things.
Yeah, and so they entered, I think, was it 2014? They entered into Syria, or was it even earlier?
I believe it was earlier. It was definitely earlier than 2014. I'm not sure right off the top of my head, but it definitely was earlier than 2014.
So early, like near the beginning of the war, more likely.
Yeah, Jabhat al-Nusra was old. Sorry, go on.
And then it was around 2016-17, they rebranded as HTS and dropped their affiliation to Al-Qaeda. And then I guess, was it a few years after that? Maybe was it 2018, 2019? They started centralizing their operations in Idlib and start sort of unifying their structure, absorbing other rebel groups. Is this correct?
Yeah, more or less. And of course in Idlib, the war has been more or less frozen for years at this point, prior to the thing. So for like 4 or 5 years, there was just nothing going on. But throughout that time, what HTS was doing in Idlib is they were setting up, an institutions and a government of their own, which quite frankly were better at providing for the Syrian people than Assad was. Idlib had more electricity, for instance, than the Syrian mainland. The economy was more stable than the Syrian mainland. When I mean the Syrian mainland, I mean Assad-controlled Syria. Assad-controlled Syria was an economic wreck. There was no electricity, there was no jobs, these sorts of things. Idlib, alhamdulillah, they managed to actually, set something up. And that's led to the success that we've seen, where not only did they build themselves up governmentally, but also, of course, built themselves up militarily. They built a disciplined military that everybody is saying now is more disciplined than the other rebel factions in Syria, particularly something called the Syrian National Army, which is the Turkish-controlled faction. HTS is showing discipline almost throughout the entirety of Syria, including, for instance, in Shia towns in the north. There are 2 Shia towns, very famous Shia towns in the north in Aleppo, where HTS fighters entered, and they got along well with the population. Okay. The population there was coming and greeting them, so on and so forth. And HTS fighters, for instance, in Damascus now are totally, they're smiling at the Christian population, the Alawi population, so on and so forth.
Okay, wow. So we can expect, seemingly for now anyway, I guess they're making their intention publicly that they're trying to distance themselves from the sectarian violence that was very common during the civil war. They're doing outreach to the Shia. Apparently, Jolani visited a Christian church in Idlib and has been making gestures like this. So this is a big part of their current PR campaign, and you think it's sincere?
So yeah, with this is important. So in Idlib, Jolani and HTS made huge gestures towards the Christian population, which is very small in Idlib, right? Now you could say, of course, this is from a pragmatic, political perspective. They're trying to engage with the Syrian Christian population, and they need to in order to appeal to the rest of the Syrian Christian population, which is about 10% of the country. Cool, right? That could very well be true. And I'm sure it is, because they've realized that in order to actually govern Syria, they can't just be sectarian. Oh, we're going to kill everybody. And of course, as I'm saying this, I think it's very important that we acknowledge minority concerns in Syria. We can't just completely brush it to the side and be like, oh, shut up and screw you. You know what I mean? Not to give too much credence to, some people see, minority. When people say minority concerns, it basically means let all the people who are doing torturing and killing off the hook. But of course, if you are a minority in Syria, if you're a Christian or if you're a Shia or an Alawi or whatever, and you're just like, some innocent guy lives in Syria, Even if you didn't support the rebels or anything like this, of course you might be afraid about what the new government might bring. Even if you see them, alhamdulillah, being very conciliatory now, you might be afraid. So I think it is important to recognize that you can't just throw these issues to the side. And in terms of in terms of HTS and what they've done, so in Idlib, again, they reached out to the Christians. They also reached out, and very interestingly, to, for instance, the Ismaili population in Idlib. The Ismailis are tiny. There is no purpose in terms of politics of trying to engage with these people. If they wanted to, they could totally throw them to the side and be like, go away. But again, the fact that they engage with them is a promising sign. It shows that, okay, maybe they are willing to really engage with all the different sections of Syrian society and try to be like, look, we're not going to destroy you. It's going to be okay. Of course, I really hope that they're sincere in this. I think it's necessary for them to be sincere in this if they have any hope of governing Syria in the future. Whilst at the same time, of course, obviously Syria, HTS, who now governs Syria, is an Islamic party. And I don't expect them to back down from that. I don't expect them to suddenly become secularists. I don't think anybody should ask them to suddenly become secularists, because the people who liberated Syria are Islamists. Islamists liberated Syria. Secularists did not liberate Syria. There is a portion of the Syrian opposition, a relatively insignificant and unimportant portion of the Syrian opposition, the previous Syrian opposition, that wanted to rely on the United States and Western support and so on and so forth, and they were liberal and secular in orientation in order to liberate Syria. And these people failed. These people lost. The United States was totally uninterested in trying to overthrow Assad. And in the end, a bunch of Islamists with very little outside support from anybody, including the Turks. Of course, obviously the Turks did help them, but not to the extent that people think they did. They liberated Syria. They liberated Syria. The army of the guy with the beards, they liberated Syria. And they have the right to determine what Syria will be for all Syrians, insofar as establishing some Islamic form of government. And I think anybody, of course, this is the debate for the Syrians to have. I'm not Syrian, whatever, it's for the Syrians. But I think sometimes when people say no, they have to give up their principles. Why would they? Why would they give up the principles they want? And I think they definitely do need to be accommodating of minorities. And I think even it's an Islamic duty for them to ensure that the minorities have a life in that country where they feel like they can live. But from some people to ask them to give up who they are, I think that's ridiculous. You've seen recently there was a big controversy amongst some Syrians because HTS and some official, pictures they put out, one of the members of their government, he had a Syrian rebel flag behind him and a white flag with the Shahada. And this caused a big uproar amongst a lot of segments of the Syrian opposition. And again, look, I'm just making my little comment. In the end, who cares? I'm not Syrian. It's for the Syrians to decide, whatever. Right? Cool. I acknowledge that. That's totally cool. But at the same time, look, if they want to have that flag, in the same way that any Hamas member will, if you look at interviews with Hamas members, they have the Palestinian flag and they have the green Shahada flag behind them. I don't know what bothers you about the white Shahada flag. It's the flag of Islam. These are pious Muslims who liberated Syria. Okay. Just because you have a white Shahada flag behind you, it doesn't mean that, we hate the Christians, we hate the Alawi, we hate the different sections of Syrian society. They're the ones who liberated it. The white Shahada flag represents their interests and represents the interests of course. Sorry, not the interests. Represents the religious expression of a lot of the Syrian majority, which is Sunni Muslim. That's cool. That's totally fine. It's not necessarily exclusionary. Now, some people might say it is exclusionary. Again, this is the debate for the Syrians to have. Whatever.
Okay, that's really interesting, Liam. Thanks so much for that, because I think you clarified a lot about who they are and what their current sort of PR strategy is, what their sort of like intentionality currently seems to be, and I guess we'll see how it plays out. So, but one thing I would do want to follow up on is, so you addressed that they're definitely not an American proxy. That they might have received Turkish support, but not to the extent that people think. So it's hard to say they're Turkish proxy the same way the SNA, Syrian National Army, definitely is.
Yeah.
And what about why are there people a lot of misconceptions right now, a lot of accusations that this was all part of some master plan from Israel and America, that now that the rebels have come in, they've destroyed the axis of resistance, and now this is good news for Israel, and simultaneously Israel is destroying the weaponry and assets of the Assadist regime. You know, they've destroyed the majority of the aircraft, majority of the navy, and even like military research stations. So what is this misconception, this grand conspiracy that people think they're very clever when they're purporting?
Again, this is largely just conspiratorial talk. Again, it's connected to a few things. One, I think it's in the context of the Gaza war, wherein obviously we've just seen Israel pummel the south of Lebanon. They killed about 4,000 people in Lebanon. Obviously destroyed huge portions of the south of Lebanon. Almost every village on the border between Israel and Lebanon has been destroyed. Obviously, hundreds of thousands of Lebanese were displaced from their homes. And Assad was he was the supply route of Iranian weapons into Lebanon. So some people, and of course, so that's number one. That's, adds on to the, again, like I said, the continued rhetoric and the continued perceptions from the Syrian civil war, wherein, the rebels were portrayed as American proxies and so on and so forth. Again, not to say that some of them weren't, some of them were, but Jolani and his guys were not. So some people say, oh, it's a very convenient timing that, Hezbollah has just been defeated in Lebanon. Hezbollah people often will deny it, but realistically they've been defeated. With all due respect, I'm not sure, it is what it is. The Gaza war is still going on. They say, oh, Assad was necessary for weapons to be transferred to Hezbollah, and now Assad's been cut off. Hezbollah is weak. The axis of resistance is destroyed. The Iranians have left Syria, and now Israel has a clean slate to do whatever they want. So this is true. Obviously, Syria was partly true. Syria was obviously an important supply route to Lebanon. But in terms of the destruction of the axis of resistance or whatever, that's a different thing. But in terms of what the Israelis wanted a weak Assad. The situation we had 3 weeks ago is what the Israelis wanted. They wanted a weak Assad that would never harm them, never do anything against them. And Assad, realistically, everybody knows, look, he's basically normalized with the Israelis. You have a weak Assad that can't support Hezbollah in any significant way, can't support Iran in any significant way, but also will contain the Syrian Sunni Muslim factions up over there. Because the Syrian Sunni Muslim factions, HTS and them lot, they do genuinely sympathize with Gaza. During the Gaza war, we've seen them hold, they had something called Gaza Fair in Idlib, and they, had this little fair in the center of Idlib city where they, put up, I don't know, like, how do you say it? They had like plays and everything going on in order to educate people about what's going on in Gaza. Of course, everybody knows now they had a book fair in Idlib, which actually was a big event in Syria. Jolani made a speech there. And at the book fair in Idlib, Yahya Sinwar's book was the #1 best-selling thing. HTS eulogized both Ismail Hania and Yahya Sinwar. And of course, the Syrians in Idlib had numerous rallies in support of Gaza, and HTS fighters, you'll often see on Telegram channels, whatever, they'll wear a patch with the red triangle in order to sympathize with Gaza. So they do sympathize with Gaza, right? They do genuinely, sincerely sympathize with Gaza. But in terms of proxy and who they are, and American conspiracy, so on and so forth. Look, what HTS did is they took advantage of the fact that Russia is occupied with Ukraine. Hezbollah was massively weakened. And I heard some people saying that maybe Jolani, he wanted to be gentlemanly because he only started his attack after Hezbollah signed the ceasefire. He didn't start the attack when Hezbollah was fighting Israel. He didn't want to stab Hezbollah in the back, even almost. God knows best about that, but that's what I heard some people say. And sorry, I've lost my train of thought. Just sorry. So in terms of the Americans and all this, it's not an American proxy. In terms of them being a Turkish proxy, the Turks definitely were involved, obviously, and the Turks have helped the Idlib government as well against Assad and so on and so forth. And the Turks definitely would have probably stopped Idlib from falling. But again, in terms of the amount of support they gave them, it's not like HTS were a bunch of Turkish militants in the same way that the Syrian National Army are. The Syrian National Army completely controlled by the Turks. They do whatever the Turks tell them to, and that's just the way it is.
Okay, excellent. So that's quite clear then. Not an Israeli or American proxy. So what will it mean, I guess, in the long run for Israel? They were happy, like you said, 3 weeks ago. They were happy with the status quo. Hezbollah's been pounded into the ground, and Assad's not going to do anything. So this is a whole new world for them. What does this mean for them? What are they thinking, and why are they, bombing, doing a massive bombing campaign into Syria? I believe yesterday was about 480 bombs they dropped, right? 480
Yep.
strikes. I don't know what it is today.
The Israelis are saying that it's either one of or even the biggest aerial campaign the Israelis have ever initiated. They've destroyed the Syrian fleet. They destroyed Syrian surface-to-air missiles, Syrian surface-to-surface missiles. They've destroyed Syrian. They destroyed an intelligence HQ, which people are saying was to conceal potential dirty deals between the previous Syrian government and between the Israelis. The Israelis have destroyed so much in Syria. And particularly, they've destroyed the Syrian air defense system. The Syrian air defense system was, decently advanced and was a threat to the Israelis. It was one of the reasons the Israelis didn't like to fly missions directly over Damascus when they were attacking Hezbollah and Iranian targets. The Syrian air defenses have been more or less completely destroyed. So what do the Israelis think? Obviously, through their offensive, we've seen that they're not enthusiastic about the rebels. They think that they could potentially be a problem in the future, and they wanted to preempt any potential problems right now. They probably don't think too much about them in terms of the potential of the rebels doing anything to them right now, because the rebels shouldn't be doing anything to them right now, and the rebels have made very, very clear, I think from their statements, that they don't intend to get in a fight with anybody. The rebels are far too weak to get in a fight with anybody. Including, of course, now that the Israelis have launched this offensive, and they've also launched a ground offensive in the south of Syria. The rebels haven't responded at all. They haven't even responded verbally, which, by the way, is a thing that a lot of people are criticizing them for, including from within their own camp, which is a different topic if we want to talk about that in a second. But in terms of what the Israelis think right now, they probably don't think anything of them right now. There's a potential threat, maybe because they know that the rebels are sympathetic with Hamas and sympathetic with the Palestinian cause in general. So they blew up a lot of their stuff just in order to be like, look, don't do anything. And even if you want to do something, we're going to take away your ability to do so. In terms of the medium term, that's a different topic if you want to talk about that in terms of the medium and long-term relations between Syria and Israel.
I'm happy to go on to that to hear what your thoughts are on that.
Okay, cool. We don't know really right now. Again, I'm not doubting the sincerity of the Syrian mujahideen who liberated their country. I'm not doubting them. Right? I'm really not. Who am I? I'm some guy in London. Who am I to doubt anybody? But at the same time, if it's complicated because the rebels, and by the way, even Hamas people are telling the rebels don't get involved in any conflict with Israel, because getting in conflict with Israel is now suicide. They would be destroyed. For instance, even there was a Hamas, sheikh. His name's Mohammed al-Astal. He's got got a Telegram channel. And he, I think right now, like today, put out a long, what do you call it? Wall of text, right? Little article thing, on his Telegram channel of recommendations to the Syrian government, the new Syrian government. Basically being like, don't provoke anybody. Focus on establishing the state. And you had Gazan accounts, journalists, so on and so forth, also telling the rebels, don't provoke anybody, focus on establishing yourselves. Because, of course, if the rebels aren't able to establish themselves, if the government isn't able to establish themselves, we know who I'm talking about when I say rebels and government, you know what I mean? They're not able to establish themselves. Look, if they got in a fight with the Israelis right now, a direct fight, they'd be destroyed like that. The Israelis have, again, massively depleted Hamas and Hezbollah, which prior to October 7th were seen as being stronger than HTS was, right? The Israelis have massively depleted them. No, the rebels can't do anything right now. If the rebels do focus entirely on building themselves up, it then leads to the question of, okay, what are their relations with the Palestinian resistance and the Palestinian cause? If they start helping the Palestinian cause, then it does two things. It draws the ire of Israel, and also, of course, through drawing the ire of Israel, draws the ire of the United States. Because the United States, if there are some people talking about the rebels are trying to potentially go for sanctions relief. Maybe the rebels want Jolani taken off the FBI most wanted list. They want the Americans to lift their sanctions. It will be very difficult for them to do this if they express some sort of action in order to aid the Palestinian cause. Right? It's very unfortunate, but it's true. And if their priority is to build their economy up, and they say, the only way we can build our economy up is if we remove American sanctions, then what does this mean for the Palestinian cause? What does it mean for any potential Syrian support for the Palestinian cause? Now, of course, I have to say that even if the Syrians don't support the Palestinian cause, which I think would be terrible, obviously, I think it's a moral obligation of everybody to try to support the Palestinian cause as much as they can. Again, whilst I am sitting in London, and what the hell is my support for the Palestinian cause? It's me going to protest and raising money. It's nothing. So look, it's up to them to decide. But I think it would be a tragedy to see that the new Syrian government isn't interested in supporting the Palestinian cause in the medium term. In the short term, of course, nobody's holding them to account. And again, everybody attacking them for not doing anything to Israel in the South is being silly. I think they should release a statement. Because why not? You know what I mean? I understand that you're trying really hard to not provoke anybody, but the Israelis have destroyed all of your military hardware and they've invaded your country. Certainly it calls for something. You know what I mean? And some people say, what will the statement do? At the very least, it will show that you're opposed to the Israelis to some degree. And it will, get rid of all these attacks on you now, which are coming from a lot of different corners. At the very least, if you look at it from purely a pragmatic perspective, hey, this might be a gain for you. Get rid of some of these criticisms, at least a little bit. But again, in terms of the medium term, I don't know, because if the Syrian government and the people who make it up, who I definitely don't doubt are made up with people who are sympathetic to the Palestinian cause and want to help the Palestinian cause, if they want to focus on building their country up at all costs, then that might mean that they can't actually do anything to help the Palestinians. And they're kind of caught in this bind where if, on the other hand, they say, okay, we're going to try to help the Palestinians somehow, well, maybe it means that their goal of building their country up can't be recognized or realized to the full extent that they want to. They can't get sanctions relief, so on and so forth. So in terms of what this means long-term for Palestine, we don't know. Obviously, having a strong Syria is always a bad thing for Israel. Push comes to shove. The Israelis don't want strong, stable Arab states near their borders because they know that no matter what, the populations of these countries support Palestine. And by the way, I'm also not saying the new Syrian government is going to join the Abraham Accords or normalize with the Israelis to that degree or anything like that. I don't think that will happen. I think there would be a coup if they tried to do that. But what I'm talking about is, for instance, the Syrian government providing Hamas with weapons, which is support, right? I think if they try to take the Turkish route of quote unquote support, the Turks they trade with the Israelis. It is what it is, including weapons. But if they take that route, then realistically, it's not really support. What are you doing? Right? It's not really support. The Turkish stance is not going to liberate Palestine or aid the Palestinians at all. And of course, also from a Palestinian perspective, it's all well and good that you build the country up long term. And again, it's a priority for the Syrians to do so. I'm not attacking the Syrians at all. Build your country up. That's all you should be focused on. I'm talking about in the medium term and the long term. I'm talking about 10 years down the line, so on and so forth. If they don't take any action or if they don't do anything, the Palestinians are fighting against time. People think the Palestinians have all the time in the world, and eventually that everybody will go and help out Palestine. Whenever it becomes stronger. We've seen now in Gaza. Gaza's destroyed. Gaza's rubble. The Palestinians are in a race against time in the West Bank as well. The Israelis, day after day, become more and more aggressive. Who knows what they'll do in terms of the annexation of potentially Area C and Area B in the West Bank. The Palestinians don't got that time. You know what I mean? It's if things continue at the trajectory they are now in the exact same manner, which I don't think they will, right? Because that's a huge statement to make. But let's just say things continue in the exact same manner they are now. Between Israel and Palestine, there's no Palestine in 100 years. There's no such thing as Palestine in 100 years. So in terms of, Syria building itself up, yes, it's a huge priority for them to build themselves up. But obviously, I would like to see them use the buildup that they do in order to help out their Palestinian brothers across the border, Palestinian brothers and sisters who are still facing a terrible occupation and who obviously they do sympathize with due to their shared experience of displacement and genocide. But again, it's a very difficult situation because it's like, what do they do? For now, build themselves up. That's all they do. And nobody's going to attack them for that. Again, I think they should release a statement. It shouldn't be that, let the Israelis do whatever they want. Because, I was reading again from some Hezbollah accounts and so on and so forth, where they were attacking the new Syrian government because they were saying, look, when Assad was around, Assad used to be able to bomb Syria. The Israelis used to be able to bomb Syria whenever they wanted, and everybody used to make fun of Assad for never replying. Everybody used to take the mick out of him for it, right? Well, if the same equation now applies to the new Syrian government, what's the difference? Do you know what I mean? Like realistically, what's the difference? If Israel says, okay, I can bomb Syria, who no matter who it is, I'm going to bomb the rebels whenever I want, and the rebels also aren't going to do anything, then all of the laughing at Assad for never replying to the Israelis, well, you have to have the same logic that applies to the new Syrian government.
No,
do you know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly. So I guess the hope is that, like you're saying, recover from the war, build up your capacity, but we do want you to be more of a force for good and in the Middle East, specifically for the Palestinians, than Assad was, who was completely standing back. The same way many other Arab regimes have stood back, or even tacitly cooperated with Israel.
Yeah, I think it's like, okay, let's say worst case scenario. Not worst case scenario. Worst case scenario is that the rebels fail to build. The new Syrian government fails to rebuild their country. There's no improvement in the lives of people, and they don't build themselves up. They don't build their power, and they also don't do anything for Palestine. That's worst case scenario. Medium case scenario is the government is able to build themselves up, improve their country, but they do nothing for Palestine. They basically say we have nothing to do with Palestine. Leave Palestine to itself. That sucks. Totally sucks. I would be heartbroken personally. but it's still better than Assad, because Assad
Exactly.
is the worst case scenario. Assad he was terrible to the Syrians, and he also didn't do anything for Palestine. Assad destroyed the Syrians, killed the Syrians, massacred the Syrians, tortured the Syrians, imprisoned the Syrians en masse, and didn't do anything for Palestine. At the very least, if the Syrian government improves the lives of Syrians, at least it's good for them. Alhamdulillah, I can say that. Thank God the Syrians are free. And obviously that's the main thing that we should be focusing on right now, is that the Syrians are free, thank God. Whilst, of course, also still recognizing that there's a genocide ongoing in Palestine, and don't stop talking about Palestine just because everybody's talking about Syria. There's still especially in the north, full massacres, right? And so please continue talking about Palestine.
That's right.
Best case scenario, the government is able to build themselves up, and with their newfound strength, they say, we are going to help out our Palestinian brothers and sisters. That's the sickest thing. If they could do that, I'd be like, thank God. And they bring a little bit of hope to the Arab world, which is just a mess. But again, it's very difficult. It's very, very difficult. It's almost like, what do you do? Because, of course, if they try to say we're going to help the Palestinians from the get-go, then they draw the ire of Israel, which will destroy them. And likewise, I don't know if they try to help out the Palestinians even in 5 years. Who knows how much they've built themselves up? They draw the ire of Israel with everything that it entails. This is one of the reasons, and in terms of, just in order to clarify my thoughts, going to war with Israel takes incredible bravery, like incredible bravery. You are walking to a death sentence for all intents and purposes. You're basically signing yourself up, especially the leadership of whoever, whether you're a government or a movement or whatever, you're signing yourself up to die en masse. It takes incredible courage for any country on the border with Israel to go to war with Israel. This is one of the reasons why, by the way, I refuse to take this from Hezbollah. I refuse. A lot of people, they make fun of Hezbollah for, they say, they were just playing around with the Israelis, so on and so forth. The South Lebanese had their country demolished. Hezbollah was huge losses amongst the leadership and so on and so forth. They took that decision for the sake of Palestine, right? Like they did. Not to dismiss everything they did in Syria. They did terrible things in Syria, helped out the monstrous Assad regime, and did monstrous things themselves. So don't mince my words here. But for instance, their decision to go to war with Israel, it took enormous courage, and I think it's silly to try to deny that. If you're just trying to deny that, it's the ideological blinders thing that I can say applies to the Shia people or leftist people or whoever else. When they say, I don't know, Assad was a great guy who helped the Palestinians. Don't have ideological blinders on with these sorts of things. You know what I mean? Recognize reality for what it is. So also because of that, I'm able to recognize reality for what it is. If the rebels went to war with Israel right now, it would be the stupidest thing in the world. Why are you doing that? Don't do that.
Yeah, these next few years are going to be really interesting, I think, to see how things progress. It's really going to be critical for, of course, the new government and for the Syrian people, and for so many people who, had to flee as well. I keep thinking about in my local community, it's become it's very much Syrian dominated over the last few years because we were already a tiny community. It was just a few Pakistani families basically where I live, but the fact that I can't even imagine to process this, the idea that there's a chance now that you can go home. It's and that's the dream. That's what we, of course, make dua for, not only for Syria, but of course for Palestine, for often I still think about the Rohingya Muslims as well. Not to mention, we've also seen a regime fall in Bangladesh recently. Certainly feels like change is really happening, and a lot of change is happening. But of course, I think it's natural as well to have that kind of, cynicism. Like you mentioned, a lot of people are cynical about Hezbollah and what they accomplish. And a lot of people, I think, are also cynical about the new government and what can they really do, or who are they really, that kind of thing. But as you've gone through and had this discussion, I do think there's a lot of hope to be taken from it. And of course, what are we without our hope? What are we without our constant du'as as well?
Yeah.
And especially seeing action actually, in front of you take place, people actually doing something to topple a dictator, to topple a regime as horrible as the Assad regime. I can't help but be inspired by that. And I think that's how really, as Muslims, we should view it as well.
Yeah.
So I really want to say, Zafar, to you, Liam, this has been really, really insightful. I think this is a topic that a lot of people are ignorant on, from even Muslims and myself included. Syria is not a topic I'm very well acquainted with, and I think a lot of people aren't even very familiar about the Assad family and that regime, but beyond Bashar. So for me, this has been really insightful, and just you covered a lot of the bases, I think, over what's been going on. So yeah, thank you very much.
Jazakallah khair. Thank you, Liam.
Thanks a lot, guys. That was awesome.
Yeah, it's been great. I hope for those of you watching, listening, you found it insightful as well. And inshallah, we'll see you on the next one. Assalamu alaikum.